Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our joint webcast with MMU and ICAEW Northwest on digital. Does it make vulnerable customers and clients more vulnerable? If you have any questions during the presentation, please use the online function to submit these, and we will come back to them at the end. I hope you enjoyed today's webcast, and I'll firstly hand you over to Stuart Finnerty from Manchester Metropolitan University. Over to you, Stuart.
Hello and welcome. So I will be facilitating today's event. The first half of the session will be Paul sharing his experience and research, and then we'll open up by questions via the chat box. So one of the reasons that I'm really excited about today is that when I left university, I was privileged to join banking at a time when there was still old school bank managers around. They acted as mentors, they gave tips, and their advice was invaluable throughout my career. So what I mean by old school bank managers, and I hope Paul will forgive me for including him in a sentence that includes old school bank managers, I mean the leaders that ran branches at the time, to steal a phrase, when the branch was the bank, when they made lending decisions based on their local knowledge and they were really part of the community. So Paul is, and forgive me for using the word old, epitome of an old school banker, but he's also so much more than that. He moved into teaching and research, and his experience has been used to educate and inspire young people in Chartered Banker, in other institutes, and here at MMU, both in person and through his published work. So I'm really interested and excited to see how he's used his research, his experience, and is able to translate that into something which will be really useful. So as well as facilitating, I'm dead excited to find out what you're going to say. So I'll hand over to you, Paul.
Setting me up to disappoint there, Stuart. I hope that everybody will get something out of the presentation. Yes, I suppose I have been an old school bank manager for many years, and I'll cover that in the introduction. But I think this topic is a real topic that needs to be explored. Particularly in today's climate, where more and more emphasis is being put on the digital approach. Just excuse me one second, Ken. I'm just going to upload my slides for you. And this is going to be interesting. I've got very much a mixed population, and I've got some professionals, as well as a number of Manchester Metropolitan students as well. So it is going to be an interesting experience, particularly if Paul can get his slides right. So just bear with me. Here we go. So can you see that, Stuart? Great. Okay. So the question is, digital, does it make vulnerable customers and clients more vulnerable? So I think a sensible place to start would actually be, what do we mean by digital? And we're fortunate, really, because digital isn't a new word. Digital is one of these words that's been around for centuries, and it just means made up of digits. So electronic data is made up of digits. So for this presentation, I'm going to talk about access to the financial sector by electronic means. So by computer, by mobile phone, whichever one it is, that is what we're going to talk about. So it will include applying for credit, dealing with a provider should you have difficulties, dealing electronically with your bank or relationship manager, or even your accountant, and dealing with those digitally rather than face to face. So during the COVID crisis, 2020, it's been a difficult time. As a lot of organizations have moved away from face-to-face interactions with their customers and their clients to a digital interaction. And then, of course, we've got to talk about what do we mean by vulnerable. So by vulnerable, we mean using the FCA definition, they define vulnerable customers as someone who, due to their personal circumstances, is especially susceptible to harm, particularly when a firm is not acting with the appropriate levels of care. So someone may not be vulnerable at the outset, but they may become vulnerable. And again, in this financial crisis, stemming from the pandemic, what we are seeing is people that maybe we didn't think of as vulnerable before now becoming vulnerable. And this particularly applies to the business sector, perhaps, as well as individuals, but also customers that were vulnerable before the crisis, now having that vulnerability increased many times. So maybe then the question is, who am I to speak on this subject? And I think that that's important for me to establish my own credibility here. Yes, as Stuart said, I worked for 32 years with Lloyds and Lloyds TSB, and 20 odd of those as a manager. I managed branches in many deprived areas, including Salford, Huyton in Liverpool, which is Harold Wilson's old constituency. And I was actually managing Huyton during the dockers' strike in Liverpool. So I could tell you a thing or two about vulnerable customers over there. And then I came back closer to home, managing branches in Lee, Bolton itself, Farnworth. So lots of issues here in these communities that I've managed. I'm also currently completing my PhD around the impact on customers that have used a payday lender. And that's given me a different insight into those vulnerabilities that those customers actually experience. So from my PhD, you can see here that the purpose of the advance enhances the vulnerability of these customers. You can see that round about 30% of the users that I interviewed or that completed a questionnaire for me were using the payday lender advance to actually meet a bill. They don't become much more vulnerable than that, really. A little bit of salary anticipation to pay off another debt. Round about 12-13% are using it for food, over 20% to meet some other form of emergency. And you will also see that just about 15% are using it for social purposes. And they tend to be students that have used payday lenders rather than families and other members of the community. Those emergency usages can be quite harrowing, really. I interviewed one who was a single mother who was using a payday lender to buy food for her baby. And I'm going to come back to that customer later in the presentation. So you can see a spread there, really enhancing the vulnerability of the customers. Then why did they use a payday lender? You can see about 30% of them have already been declined by the bank. But if you have a look at the next column, nearly 40% believe that they would be declined by the bank. And that's an even more worrying proportion for me. And this is why they move towards a payday lender. So 66%, 2/3 of the people that completed questionnaires for me either had been declined by the bank or thought they would be declined by the bank. And then we'll have a look and you'll see that round about 12% didn't consider using a bank at all, and just less than 20% went straight to the payday lender with no other consideration, purely because it was convenient. And from the actual interviews that I undertook, what did I find there? Well, this concept of willful blindness plays a large part in digital access of financial services. So what is willful blindness? Willful blindness, and we're all guilty of this, where we know that something is there, but we don't want to see it. With the payday lenders, of course, it's a charge, it's the interest. That they know it's there and they know that it's high, but they don't want to actually know what it is. Strangely enough, from the questionnaires as well, round about 50% of the user payday lenders actually think that the charge is high, but it's reasonable. There's an inbuilt acceptance, if you like, that they are high risk, so therefore the charge is going to be high. Something that surprised me from my findings is that they tend to feel a little bit ashamed of having used a payday lender. And maybe this is around the publicity that's given to them. Even campaigns such as those by the FCA, the Ombudsman, and they're reading in the papers all the time that the rates are high and people really shouldn't be using them. So when they do use them, they feel a little bit ashamed, which leads to them discussing it with very, very few people. I actually interviewed one young lady, and she hadn't shared with her partner that she'd used a payday lender until she had to justify to her partner why she was coming seeing this 60-year-old chap. And this leaves them feeling very, very stigmatized, like they're part of the population that nobody really wants to know and that really shouldn't exist. And again, that increases their level of stress. And I ask the question, does that then make them more vulnerable? And that's something that we will come back to. So why should we be concerned about vulnerable customers? It isn't just the financial sector that is concerned about vulnerable customers. Of course, we see in the utilities sector as well concerned about their vulnerable customers. You hear this term about fuel poverty, where people can't afford to heat their homes. And do we really want to live in a society where the cost of the fuel is the deciding factor as to whether you put on your gas fire or your central heating? And United Utilities find that 3 out of 10 of their customers are struggling to meet their liabilities. Fuel poverty, 10.4% in England. 2017, banks making £2.4 billion from overdrafts, and around about 30% of that income was from unarranged overdrafts. So people that haven't controlled their expenditure and creep over the limit, banks are making just less than £1 billion from those customers. The FCA find that 50% of people in the UK are potentially vulnerable, 55% in Wales. And what did they mean by this? I toddled along to a meeting where Andrew Bailey, who's now the governor of the Bank of England, was the chief of the FCA. And he defined that potential vulnerability was, could they replace the washing machine if it broke and was beyond repair? They're saying that 50% of people in the UK, that would empty their savings. They would have no savings left. 30% of children in the UK live in relative poverty. Okay, increasing to 37% in 2024. Just 4 years, they're projecting that it's going to increase by 7 percentage points. Massive. 8 credit unions went out of business in 2018. Why have I mentioned those? Because they're seen as the more ethical lenders, if you like. 2018, Wonga goes into administration, Wage Day advance, Quick Quid, Sunny go into administration this year. Why am I mentioning those? Well, if the ethical lenders are going out of business with the credit unions and they can't turn to the payday lenders because the new regulations mean that they can't survive, then where are these people going to go now? Where is my single mother that needs to feed her baby? Where is she going to go? And I think that the societal implications around how the financial sector deals with its vulnerable customers are massive. Pardon me. So I want to look at vulnerable customers and branch closures. So I've just picked a random number of years where the data was easily accessible. Between 2015 and 18, banks closed nearly 3,000 branches. When I worked in banking, I left banking about 2010. I thought that we closed all of our potential closures. But of course, it's gathered acceleration since then, which is amazing. And we've broken this down here, or which I've, thank you very much. I've broken this down to regions. You can see that Scotland has the biggest number of branch closures, followed by the southeast, the northwest, the southwest. And the question that I ask is, are we closing branches in the areas where there are most vulnerable customers? Because those branches are profitable, basically. So how do disabled customers access their bank accounts when the branches are closed? Yes, many disabled customers can access their accounts digitally, but typically at an extra cost where the equipment needs to be adapted, and our bank's helping them with that cost. How do exploited customers raise their complaints with no local contact? And again, the banking sector, unfortunately, has got many examples of exploited customers. And how do vulnerable customers discuss their issues with the bank if there is no local branch to do that? Again, we are seeing during the COVID crisis increased use of things like Zoom that we're on today. But there are issues with that. You've seen me make a mess of one or two parts of the presentation already. So vulnerable customers, do they have the equipment that they need, the hardware? Do they even have access? What do banks do? The YouTube clip there is showing the greater reliance around digitalization of the support. So chatbots and things like that. And I'm asking, is that enough? Can we go further? Can we be more proactive? The challenges, the online challenges, Sterling, Monzo have launched products that allow customers to block gambling expenditure on the cards. Barclaycard have done the same. So it's not just the challenges, but they are giving us these new ideas. And if you can block that, then is that enough? Sterling allows you to switch a block on and off, which surely defeats the purpose of the block. With Monzo, you have to contact a dedicated customer service team, and they will decide whether you can take the block off or not. And what I do like about that is it takes about 48 hours to remove that block, and hopefully that friction will be enough to make the habitual gambler, perhaps the gambler that is addicted, then that 48 hours will give them sufficient thinking time to not go through with the instant reaction that they're feeling. So all bank websites have sections on vulnerable customers. RBS focus on relatives in using powers of attorney and enduring powers of attorney. obviously focusing on the more elderly and viewing them as vulnerable. Lloyd's, would you believe that vulnerable customers aren't in the search button? So there's somewhat to do there. 9 out of 10. So it focuses on lost cards and PPI complaints. Ninth out of 10 on the list, is money worries. Okay. But on the other side of the coin, I know that Lloyd's do look after their vulnerable customers. They employ Macmillan nurses and pay for them to be on hand where their expertise would help. So it isn't that they don't care, it's just that they need to think it through a little bit more, I think. Barclays, 99 plus results of the first few are on lost cards and data breaches. And their third is on money worries with some case studies. So a bit of a mixed bag, really. I mentioned before about in order to access help digitally, you need the hardware, you need the computer or the phone, but you also need internet access. Now, this graph from the ONS states that 93% of households now have internet access, which is great. It doesn't measure the quality of that internet access. But the question stands, what about the other 7%? Mobile phones and smartphones are by far the most popular devices, again from the ONS. You can see the age groups, 16 to 24, around about 96% access the internet through their mobile phone. But as we go down that scale, about 40% plus from the 65-year-old and over access it through their phone. So then that makes it more expensive than if you've got to buy a laptop instead of a mobile phone to access the help that you need. So yes, what about the 7% without broadband access? Which element of society has no mobile access? Who are those 7%? And who are those with no mobile phones? Who do they tend to be? Or certainly the mobile phones with the digital and web access. Yeah. Which age group most represents the financially vulnerable? Is it those at the bottom that are still making the way, or is those that have hard times during their life, if you like, or is it those that RBS needs to focus on, the more elderly? And what's being done to support these that have those accessibility issues? So if they can't access online, then where do they go when the branches are closing as well? So clearly, face-to-face offers better support to the vulnerable. Bold statement. And Barrack says, let me think about that. He's got a lot to be thinking about at the minute. And it isn't as simple as saying, well, it should all be face-to-face or it should all be digital. Here, obviously, face-to-face has caused a few problems as well over the years. Some of us are old enough to remember the pension crisis and the endowment policy mis-selling on interest-only mortgages, PPI, 43 billion. That cost directly, never mind the add-ons. RBS Global restructuring, sorry, Stuart. HBOS and Quayside in this memorable photo here, and what damage that did to the banking sector as a whole. But accountants as well have had their issues dealing with, dare I say, vulnerable businesses, Carillion, Wirecard, BHS, Thomas Cook. In all of these, the accountants face criticism, and is some of that down to relying upon digital examination instead of face-to-face examination and getting more close to what is actually going on there. And what about ethics? Does ethics have a role to play? Surely the ethical culture has to come from the top. And it's difficult when chief executives are paid massively and their performance maybe doesn't reflect that and staff are being made redundant. We've got historical evidence, Leeson, Cavil, of course. If the line manager remuneration is dependent on the earnings of their staff, then they are less likely to be ethical in their dealings with their staff. Deontological ethics, playing to the rules, is not enough. And we're going to have a look at some of that reactive legislation in a second. I suggest we need virtuous leaders who do things because it's the right thing to do, not because the rules don't forbid it. And particularly looking at vulnerable customers falls into that criteria. So we've had some recent regulatory changes that have tried to help us deal with vulnerable customers. Some of us will remember the 2012 Retail Distribution Review, where advisors charge fees rather than commission. 2015, the FCA take over the regulation of all credit from the OFT, including the Consumer Credit Act, including the control of the payday lenders. And they reduce their earning capacity, perhaps quite rightly, reducing the fees charged and a number of rollovers where the customers in difficulty would roll over the debt, create a new debt to clear the old one with new charges and all the implications there. 2018, the FCA announced radical changes to the overdraft market, single interest rate, aiming to prevent exploitation. Do you remember us talking about those customers that were charged massively for the unauthorized overdraft? This was an aim to prevent that. 2019, caps on rent to own companies. Perhaps the best known one is Brighthouse. So what happened following that? Well, with the retail distribution review, because advisors charge fees and they need to earn their income, it meant that the bottom end of the market was largely priced out. And these now become more reliant on this thing called robo-advice, which is great if you have the right technology to access it. But with a minimum fee, £500, £750, somebody gaining a £10,000 redundancy perhaps, or in need of pension advice for small amounts, they're not going to pay that amount of money to get advice. The regulation of the payday lenders, we've already mentioned that a number of the larger players fail, reducing the alternative available to these vulnerable customers. The changes to the overdraft market, what happens there? Unarranged overdrafts are almost impossible for anyone to access, never mind vulnerable customers. And again, this leaves them more exposed that the items that may have just been crept into an unauthorized overdraft in the past are now again returned and not paid. And Brighthouse and the rent to own companies being capped, we've got to wait and see for that to work its way through. Yeah, I think that's getting mixed up with the COVID crisis as well. So the Basel regulations, the bankers in the room will be familiar with these, aim to prevent bank collapse by keeping capital in proportion to the risk. Okay, so the lending need to reflect the risk. So the charge and the interest rate for the vulnerable customers, which are no doubt higher risk, much higher, meaning that they find it difficult to either gain the credit, or if they do, they have to pay very, very highly for it. And the impact, the Lending Standards Board, identification and treatment of vulnerable customers continues to be an area of focus and priority for the industry. with the need for financial institutions to rebuild trust remaining high on the agenda. And can digitalisation rebuild that trust? And that's a real question. The Federation for Small Businesses, there's nothing in the current legislative framework to stop another GRG, Global Restructuring Group style scenario. And what does that say about the regulations that have been brought in? If the FSB say, well, they're not going to prevent a future repeat of that. So what's the impact of all of this on vulnerable customers? High risk, small value customers find it almost impossible to get small advances from the banks or believe they will be declined by the bank. I'm citing my own research there. The same customers now have fewer options, despite the financial needs still needing to be met. And this is the thing that we've got to remember with these vulnerable customers. Just because finances are tight for them doesn't mean that they haven't got the financial needs that need to be met. So, for example, when the FCA tried to protect vulnerable customers with the credit card and only making the minimum payment on the credit card, so banks have to write to them if they're just making the minimum payment, and then after 2 years or so, they will automatically increase the minimum payment to reduce the debt. Now, I can understand why that is there, but how does that help a vulnerable customer where things are already tight? And yes, access to some basic financial services are now easier. Yes, they are, absolutely. Transferring money from account to account, sending money to somebody else, all of that is fantastic, and the technology is incredible allowing that. But does it help them with the more complex needs? Does it help them to budget day to day, week by week? And does it in fact help their vulnerability? So is digital the solution or not? I personally, and my research would suggest that digital has been part of the problem as well as potentially being part of the solution. So if you can just sit in your room, and again, this is one of the interviews that I undertook, this chap who was on his mobile phone, his wife was sat next to him, and he applied for 2 loans in a matter of an hour, didn't tell his wife, and that just led to horrendous problems later down the line, as you'd expect. And maybe with a face-to-face interaction, an experienced lender would be able to realize that when you're asking the questions, the customer doesn't want to answer those questions, and then you can probe as to deeper why he doesn't want to answer those questions. Whereas with the digital, one provider straight to another provider, 2 loans, 25 grand within an hour. Horrendous. And because they've accessed it digitally, are they then likely to seek human interaction to help solve the problem? Are they even going to access a digital solution to their problem? Again, from my research, the stigmatization that they feel, the embarrassment, the shame that they feel, it then becomes a barrier to them seeking help. They don't even discuss it with their partners. So how they're going to find some way to interact either digitally or otherwise with their bank when they've accessed their money digitally, and they haven't got that relationship with us. But I do feel that banks need to offer more than just digital solutions. Yes, they are embarrassing. They need to be prompted into positive action and not further stigmatized into further and deeper default. So there's a list of references there should anybody want to look them up. And that's the presentation part from me. Stuart, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Paul. Just a reminder to everyone, if you've got questions for Paul, pop them in the chat box and myself and Paul will pick them up and answer as many as we can. If we get more questions than we can answer, we'll respond to you after the presentation. But a few that I've had direct message to me already. The first one is, it says it's a competitive environment that the banks operate in. So to what extent can they take on responsibility for dealing with vulnerable customers?
Okay, I don't think banks have any alternative than deal and help their own vulnerable customers. Once the relationship is set up, I think part of that relationship is to help your customers through the difficult times as well as the more comfortable times. And I think regulation in some way has got in the way of this. And I think that the constant chase for profit and relevant capital has got in the way here as well. So the whole concept of risk-weighted assets, which the bankers in the room will understand, where you have to keep capital back in proportion to the risk seen in your portfolio, means that you are less willing to take on board that risk, even for existing customers. Anecdotally, I've seen examples of where banks have done a full refinance package for a customer to make the repayments more affordable, to help them through this period of vulnerability. But then they've had to charge them a almost extortionate rate of interest, because that interest rate has to reflect the risk. But of course, the whole package has been put together to reduce the risk. So, but the risk has to be reflected as it is at the time of negotiating the refinance package. So we've got to find some way of helping these vulnerable customers without at the same time punishing the vulnerable customers with a higher interest rate. And I know it's not easy, but the capital allocations need to be looked at and a more creative way, dare I say that, for bankers, of allocating the capital to look after these vulnerable customers needs to be established, even if it means a separate fund that looks after these vulnerable customers from perhaps a less vulnerable, so that the relationship managers can get involved with the vulnerable customers and feel confident that they can actually help the vulnerable customer through, like I said, this difficult period of vulnerability. Does that answer the question, Stuart?
It does. I never thought I'd hear you suggesting that bankers should be more creative, given the topic. So thank you for that. We've got some questions coming in. A question from Matt Wills. Is supporting vulnerable customers channel specific, or they should have a more global strategy across all the sales channels?
Okay, I think treating vulnerable customers should come from the top. And I guess we've all been in credit meetings where we've assessed our portfolios and looked at the high risk customers and what we're going to do with them. But I think vulnerability is different to being high risk in many ways. The vulnerability is something that can be addressed, that can be helped, that the customers can be helped through. To answer Matt's question, I think, yes, I think it should be on the board agenda, as a set agenda on the board. What are we doing to address our vulnerable customers? But within that, the approach within different departments will need to be different. So I mentioned about the examples where accountants have been criticised for the way that they've dealt with vulnerable businesses. BHS is a great example. You couldn't help BHS in the same way that you could help a granny whose husband has died and she was dependent on his pension. Yes. So yes, it should be throughout the organisation, but the way that you would deal with them would need to differ from case to case and department to department. But it doesn't, the basic ethics of it don't change. The basics are the same. It's just the way that you would interact with them and solve the problems that would need to differ.
Wonderful, thank you, Paul. I've got a couple of questions. I'm going to ask you two questions together because I think they may be potentially linked. We've had a question from John, and he wants to know, to what extent do you think the competition laws need to change to allow banks to work together on this? And without leading you, Evans put a question here highlighting branch closures across particularly rural areas in Scotland. Are the banks actually committed to expanding access to vulnerable customers, given that these are the areas not going to have internet, etc.?
Yes, yeah. If I deal with the second one first, if I could, I think that population that Evan mentions about the rural areas. For a short time in my career, I was actually dealing with an agricultural portfolio, and that is so difficult. You'll be aware, asset rich and cash poor. So their vulnerability is a little bit different. But if we look at those rural areas and put those together, those tend to be the ones with either no internet access or poor internet access. And then put that together with non-profitable banks or non-profitable branches, then how do the banks help those vulnerable customers? And I do like the idea of that, dare I say, Euro Bank NatWest have developed there with the mobile bank and the mobile branches. And I know that they look at increasing the relationship with the post office a little bit more than just being transactional. And I do like some of the ideas I'm reading about banking hubs, where all of the banks could access the one hub, maybe one day a week, but it would be the same hub. They got big technological issues to overcome there, but if the post office can do it, I'm sure the banks can. Where one day a week NatWest will be there, then Lloyds will be there, and then HSBC, and they can work it out that way. And I think that could be a way of helping these. And yes, I think Evan is exactly right. Do they have an obligation to increase the accessibility to these vulnerable customers? And they don't have a legal obligation to do that, but I would say they certainly have an ethical responsibility, not only to support their own vulnerable customers, but maybe vulnerable sectors and geographical sectors of the society. And then that brings it nicely, as you suggested, perhaps to the competition law. Should they share ideas more? Should they be able to share technologies more that work with this crucial sector of the economy, really, rather than be concerned about sharing practices for the fear of this cartel judgment that could be passed down on them. And maybe that does need some legislation, that where you are working together to support vulnerable customers, then that isn't anti-competitive. Yeah, that really is outside of normal competition law, because these customers need some original thinking. They need some original support, whether it is the bank or their accountant that needs to access them in different ways. Yeah.
Well, quite nicely, following on from a question of legal issues and some creative thinking, Emma Holt, with her legal background, has asked if any of the lenders build a face-to-face discussion into the digital process. And I think she's thinking of Zoom, that type of thing, into the process.
Yeah. Sometimes you've got to doff your cap, haven't you? And I doff my, that's a good northern saying. I doff my cap at sometimes what the original thinking that lenders come up with. And I do like the movement down the mortgage front, where they realise that it is difficult to undertake a full detailed mortgage interview, perhaps face to face, because of the COVID restrictions. So a lot of those are moving to Zoom, supported by actual physical documentation. But most of us will know that you can share documents on these platforms as well. And a lot of the mortgage arrangers now are doing more of their interviews that way. And I think that that's a good idea. And certainly a lot of the commercial lenders are doing the same. And that's great. So we could have a Zoom call with the banker, the accountant, the solicitor, and the client. Yeah. Whereas under COVID restrictions, you really couldn't do that. But by being creative, you can. And what I'd like to see really is that same level of creativity brought into this arena. Yes. So what about that vulnerable customer that can't afford the all singing, all dancing mobile phone so they can access these things, hasn't got access to a laptop? And again, Barclays with their Legal Eagles and the lab that they've got in Manchester, I quite like what they're trying to do there and increase the access to the digital products with no cost at all. And we know that some of our students work in those sort of support roles. So I would just like to see them being creative. So if we have got a vulnerable customer that it needs to have a sensible sit-down discussion with somebody that may take an hour, may take more, may need repeat interviews, that we actually provide them with a laptop so they can do that on hire, so they can have it for 3 months or so, give it back, refurbish it, give it out to the next one. And I'd love us to be able to do that. And that would be a great use of time and resource, because vulnerable customers, yes, towards the end of their life, maybe they are continually vulnerable and that's not going to go away. But most vulnerable customers, it's a time in their life, yeah, that we can help them through, that we can stay with them. And if that doesn't increase loyalty, then what the heck would? So if we can help them through this difficult period, whether that's a personal customer, a business, corporate customer, whatever it is, then I think that that's surely worthwhile.
Well, I think you're thinking on the same lines as Matt Wills. If it's the Matt Wills, I think it is, works for Building Society. Asks, I wonder at what point it'll be cheaper to find customers with IT to access digital channels rather than run a branch or mobile network. So I don't know if you want to touch on that.
Yeah. And I believe that we have this moral responsibility to look after our more vulnerable. Yes. And Matt's knocking on the same door as I am. I think that if they haven't got the access to the digital channels, certainly in these times, surely we can provide that. Yes. And I've been a little bit critical of the regulators and the Basel and all the rest of it, but they have made sure that certainly the Basel regulations have helped us to make sure that our banks can see through a crisis like this. And the banks, again, in this last quarter, seem to be profitable, and maybe just diverting a little bit of that profit to providing tech for our more vulnerable customers, even if it is only on a short-term basis, to help them communicate with others during this difficult time. Then, yes, I think Matt's knocking on the same door as I am, really.
Yeah, he's promoting tablets that are sub £40. He says seems a no-brainer. Yes. So he's definitely on your side of things.
Yeah.
A slightly more challenging issue.
If I knew what a tablet was.
Well, maybe that's part of the. I think Barclays have got legal eagles that might be able to help you if that's not going to offend some of the banks on here. A question maybe more challenging without a technical response maybe is a question from Declan Store Carroll, highlighting that a grandmother's vulnerable and has no access to the internet, doesn't online bank. She's got a mobile, but minimum access to the internet, maybe part of the 7% you highlighted. Used to visit a local branch, but it's getting more difficult. Are there any other alternatives to help that sort of vulnerable customer?
At present, it is difficult. Most banks will have a telephone helpline. And to be fair to them, the staff that man those telephone helplines are very highly trained. and a lot of them have superb interpersonal skills, and are trained to help people like that grandmother. Is it an absolute replacement for the services that maybe she's had in the past, and maybe the services that other people can access? No, it isn't perfect, but it is there, and that grandmother could access those. And if it is a grandmother that's worried about the bills, usually the bank would ring them back. Just take the number off her and actually ring us, so it's on their bill and not the grandmother's. It's not ideal. No, it isn't. And particularly these days, it is in this environment, it is difficult for them to just jump into a cab and go to the local branch, or even arrange for a relative to come and pick them up and take them to a local branch. That's even more difficult. But this is where the ideas like Evan was coming up with. He's obviously priced these tablets less than £40. I was thinking a laptop like we're working on.
I think there's going to be an advert he's going to put on in a minute, which is on the right lines.
Yeah. Well, what Declan's done there is identified the vulnerable, a vulnerable sector that is crying out for help. And just because the amounts are smaller, perhaps, doesn't mean the bank's obligation is any less. The obligation is exactly the same. It's not proportional to the amount involved. And I do think there is more scope for us to overcome this with a combination of digital and face-to-face. And I think the COVID crisis has accelerated a lot of the digital enhancements that were planned for years down the line. It's really brought them more forward and accelerated that rate of change, which some have found difficult to cope with, and some have actually welcomed.
A question maybe following on from that. Again, we've maybe assumed personal customers here, but as a question coming via the Chartered Banker anonymously, do you think the expansion of online platforms to provide finance for businesses and online business lenders is making business owners more vulnerable?
Oh, absolutely. And I tried to be careful throughout the presentation to include businesses. And that's why I included the Quayside investment issues and GRG, because it isn't unique to face or digital, where we're saying face-to-face is wonderful, nothing ever happened with face-to-face. Look at all the problems that digital are bringing in. But also we need to be aware that digital isn't the solution. So are the digital platforms encouraging vulnerability? I think there is an argument for that. It's making access to finance a little bit too easy. In the case study that I provided of the guy, perfectly true, one of the people that I interviewed sat next to his wife applying for 25 grand worth of credit on his mobile phone, sat next to her, and didn't tell her and didn't consult her. I think it's the same with businesses as well, particularly with the COVID business loans have been set up, where the banks were encouraged to reduce the processing time as much as possible. Then again, that just leaves it open to vulnerable customers exploiting the system. And whilst it's not an easy thing to identify, but I've always found myself that desperate people do desperate things. So the businesses that are vulnerable, that are desperate for that cash, are probably the same ones that are manipulating the COVID loan schemes, because the processes were so light and the touch was so light. If they would have had to go face-to-face and be interviewed face-to-face, yes, that would have put more friction in the process, but it would have also probably meant that they got a better solution than they have done now. Where, yes, it's okay for this next 12 months, but what happens after that? Where the payments then kick in. And some of the online platforms, of course, are charging massive rates of interest, aren't they? I read an article the other day, 17%. At a time when base rate is 0.1%, and they're charging 17% on the government guaranteed loans, or larger guaranteed, depending which way they've gone. So yes, I think it's a great point that anonymous pollster has made. That it's given another avenue for these vulnerable customers, these desperate customers, to exploit. But was it ever thus? It just makes it more easy, if you like, with less friction.
So one link to that, to the gamers coming via the chartered bankers, is you've got these 7% who are not on the internet at the moment.
Yes.
How would you build confidence with them, particularly when we're getting more and more scams come in and text messages? Now, I've had one today from HMRC, and I don't know if it's from HMRC. I'm certainly not going to click on the link. But how do you address that with the vulnerable customers?
You get charged for not paying your tax bill, then. But yeah, it is absolutely an issue. This is why I'm a little bit concerned. Was it Evans in his £40 tablets, that maybe the protections built into those won't be as good as perhaps more sophisticated hardware would protect these people. And I think if we are providing the hardware for these people to use, and we have the responsibility to make sure that all of those protections are in place and all of the blocks are in place, and to reduce the non-essential contact. We aren't there to provide them with social contacts and the rest of it. We're there to help them through this period of vulnerability, so we can actually slim down and limit the use a little, so that those risks, other risks that we're all aware of with internet access, aren't there. And I think that again would then help our moral argument and our ethical argument, that we are actually helping these vulnerable customers without exposing them to other risk. Yeah, because that's the last thing you'd want to do, isn't it? But we need other people to get involved in this as well, such as the government in increasing that reach for effective broadband throughout the UK, so that then a lack of effective broadband isn't a contributor to vulnerability, and the solutions that the vulnerable customers can access. So the rural areas really need to have as good an access as you have sat there in Manchester Metropolitan.
Which is a nice way to sort of end there. I have to say, Paul, on this new Zoom setup where I can only see you, it's easy to forget there's lots of other people on the call, but yes. it has felt really like a really nice chat to examine, and I feel like I've learned a lot, and I've enjoyed it, certainly putting the questions from everybody else.
I'm delighted with the number of questions that have been raised, which suggests an interest in the area, and if they're bankers or students that are interested in seeking solutions to this issue, then that can only be good.
And getting involved in university courses and being part of the Chartered Institute or the ICAW is definitely a place to do that. So a big thank you from me. I'm going to hand back to Heather, Paul, from the Chartered Banker, because I mentioned that HMRC had texted me. I think Heather's going to give us a bit of an update on something else from HMRC that is coming very soon. But thank you very much from me, Paul. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Useful. Handing back to Heather.
Thank you, Stuart. I'd just like to thank you, Paul, for providing such an insightful webcast today, and to Claire and Stuart for their help with planning and running this joint event. Thank you to our listeners as well. We had some really great questions today, which is really good. For members of the Chartered Banking Institute, today's webcast can be recorded as part of your ongoing CPD. Please remember to record this via the logbook in the members area of the website. And we'd also welcome your feedback on today's webcast. I'll be sending out a short survey post-webinar, and this email will also include details of our next joint event, which will be on making tax digital. Once again, we'd like to thank you for your participation and thank you for listening. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Heather. Bye.